was around. Always loved it. Nintendo 64 music, GameCube music, Nintendo DS music, Game Boy Advance music. And I've been getting more into doing compositions and sound effects for video games. And, the more I learn about it, the more you look into it, it's like, I feel like it's, if we're talking about, really when electronic music really became more intricate, in the 90s. Is that a fair assessment?
I'd say so.
When it stopped becoming just techno and it became, you have these multi-instrumental, highly polyphonic compositions. You have these video games where it's like people are being paid professional sums of money to recreate, like the Nintendo 64, you couldn't just put like an MP3 of a jazz band on it, but you're going to pay some guy to make a recreation of it using sounds that they can fit on the video game cartridge. So it's really like early adaptations of, styles of music like jazz and rock into forms of electronic music that could be put onto the game cartridges. So in terms of the development of electronic music, especially I think electronic music with strong melodic composition, it's an important part of the history and development of the genre.
It's like, along those lines, like, we were just saying about like the 90s being kind of a way for electronic music moving forward and becoming more complicated and stuff like that. Because like, you're right, before it was like lay down a simple beat for a backing track, like with the Lindrum, like all the pop bands that use the Lindrum to have like a basic kind of form. And it's like, shit, if you like follow electronic music back to like the Commodore 64 and shit, you have these 3-channel sound chips. And like, they were doing music that was technically way more complicated than any other electronic music at the time. And like...
Oh, like the
the
systems with like the built-in FM chips?
Exactly,
like
exactly.
Genesis?
Well, yeah, I mean, shit, look at what they did with Streets of Rage. You know what I mean? Like, you had club tunes.
I watched this really interesting Red Bull documentary series on the history of video game music. It's pretty cool. I'd recommend anybody who's interested to check it out. And they talked about how early, I think it was Sega Genesis cartridges, had built-in synthesizer chips into the actual cartridge itself to provide additional timbres and polyphony. I'm not sure what the literal technical advantages were, but they did exist.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's just weird to think like video games, which especially in the 80s and 90s were considered toys. I mean, like, you look at the marketing for I'm going to call it the Mega Drive, the Genesis, the Mega Drive. The marketing for it was like, hey...
Are they the same? I didn't know that.
Yeah, the Mega Drive's the UK name for the Genesis.
I didn't know that.
So it's the exact same thing. It's like no different at all. But like, the marketing was like, hey, buy this for your kids this Christmas. You know what I mean? Like, it was a toy, and the NES was a toy. It was in like Argos catalogs and shit, and like Walmart and Toys R Us and whatnot, And it's like, a lot of the music that was on there, like NES stuff even, like Mega Drive stuff, and like, a lot of the music that was on there was like, way more complicated than stuff that was topping charts. And took way more effort to make. I mean, like, fucking programming songs in assembly language, like, and video game music producers don't get enough credit for what they've done. At all. I mean, shit, I'd say a lot of electronic shit is influenced by music, game music. I mean, like, people like CFAX Acid Crew, it's like, he openly says, like, he just wants that sound from his childhood, but like, he wants to make it himself, and he does, and it creates this entirely kind of new type of electronic music. And yeah, I think video game soundtrack people are massively underappreciated. I mean, like, recently the guys that did the Streets of Rage stuff, they've been like going around and touring it live, and that's really cool. That like something
like a live band.
Yeah, well, it's just the two of them, but they're like recreating it with like your typical electronic musician setup, like controllers and shit. And it's cool that it's getting like that kind of credibility. Whereas like it's not just the music. I mean that was printed on vinyl as well. The Streets of Rage soundtrack was printed on vinyl.
Originally, or was it repress?
Like I think maybe a couple of years after they made the game, it was printed to vinyl because people were like, "This is a good techno record." You know, it's not like this is some music for you to beat people up to in a video game. It's like this is a good techno record.
There's some interesting stuff pressed to vinyl. I think if you look in Discogs, there's definitely like a 7-inch that Nintendo put out in like the 80s of like
Really?
Super Mario Land
that's
theme.
cool.
Yeah, but I mean like it's one of those like Discogs rarities, like you know
Yeah.
$40 7-inch or some bullshit.
Yeah. That's cool though. I didn't know that. I like that.
Yeah, if you hunt around Discogs, it's crazy stuff. I'm always going back and forth between two different processes where I have like 5 tracks I'm working on at once and I like switch in between them working, or I have like one track that I focus on and I work on it till it's done. And I often find that giving yourself the discipline to work on just one track and finish through till it's a really quality product that you're happy with is the best way to go about things. I feel like oftentimes I work on multiple tracks at once, it's a result of a lack of discipline or focus, and that I'm kind of like, you know, instead of writing the dope melodic piece I know this track needs, I'm just gonna go fart around and fucking poop some amens in a new file. So I think that I make the best tracks when I just, you know, stay disciplined, focus on one piece. I don't know about you, but I find that
I mean, I personally probably have way too little concern for polish. I mean, a lot of my tracks, so the album I've been working on up until, like, I finished it like last week, and it's all hardware, so it's a new thing for me. I'd never done that before. I'd never worked with hardware. I didn't understand how MIDI worked, you know, like MIDI cabling and shit like that. So I made this whole album, and like, I'd start on an idea, and then that leads to another idea, and then I would finish a track, and it would take me like a day or 2 days or whatever, you know. And then I just record it from the mixing desk and try and get a good take, because I'm doing all the manipulation live and shit. And then I'm like, that'll do. Yeah, it's like, I think if I try and aim for perfection, it's gonna become contrived. And it's like, I agree with focus massively. Like one of my last albums, Loather, it's like some of those tracks are like 6 years old, you know, and when I started them, the aim was to finish this album, Loather. But then I just didn't, you know, I just didn't. And there were some tracks I didn't include on it, because I worked on them like 6 years ago and then tried to work on them again, and it's like, the lack of focus on it just fucked it up. Just because you start something, it doesn't mean you have to finish it. And if you don't finish it, that doesn't mean you've wasted your time. Like, the amount of times I've started something and then created one little tiny idea in it, but like got rid of the rest and like started again, but like that idea's still in my head and I've kept that one idea. That means that last track wasn't a waste of time. Despite the fact no one's ever gonna hear it, and I didn't like finish it, but it was like, you know, a long way through. The fact it didn't come out doesn't matter, because I learned something from it. I mean, you know, does that make sense? Like, if you learn from the failure, or not even failure, if you learn from the aborted project.
right. I mean,
you've got something. You've got something from it, you know?
I think about that, like, kind of just like, I don't know, practicing the guitar or anything else, like, I don't know, sometimes just the process of making dope stuff, like, you just gotta sketch out and doodle a bunch of shit before you make the fucking sick thing that you're gonna show your homies.
Sure, like, you can't just, like, you can't consistently shit out gold without coming up with something that doesn't work.
Yeah,
you can't do that.
Experiment. Sometimes you just gotta fucking and just like make some bullshit.
Make a fucking mess and then take something out of that mess. Yeah, like you can't release everything you make. It wouldn't work. Like, because shit. I mean, like, writers don't release every single word that they put onto the paper. Like, they streamline that shit, and then they're like, this is what I want people to see. And there are bits that no one's ever gonna see, you know what I mean? And that's probably for the best. I mean, Yeah, I've taken track ideas from tracks that, you know, people seem happy with the end product, but like if I'd released the original one, people probably wouldn't be anywhere near as excited. Like it might be boring or it might just sound like shit, you know, but you did take something. So I don't think anything is a waste of time, ever. I don't think anything is ever a waste of time. You know, it's like I'm working on a video game, and the amount of times I've restarted models, like I've spent weeks making a model and then restarted it, and then, you know, and then by the end of the 6th time, I've like finished pulling polygons and stuff around. I'm like, okay, that one would do. It doesn't mean the first 4 were a waste of time. They're not a waste of time.
Of course.
I learned shit. It's like, yeah, I think anything creative is the same. You have to learn stuff. You can't just say, oh, I'm gonna release everything I ever touch. It doesn't work. I do get asked this stuff a lot.
Nobody asks me.
You know, people might as well not ask me because I never have anything useful to say. Like, people ask me, like, oh, how do I get to a point where a label wants my CD? Or, you know, how do I get to a point where I'm, you know, because I play a lot of places nowhere near my home. It's like people ask, how do you get that? And it's like, I think, for me, I just feel like the best thing to do is not try and aim for that shit, because there's so much room for disappointment. Like, I'm not saying don't have aspirations, I'm just saying, like, don't set out to do something that you don't know is gonna happen. Like, I never intended for anyone to hear the Goreshit stuff, and then they did. And then I never expected anyone to buy the Goreshit stuff, and then they did. And I never expected to get offered a gig halfway across the world, and I did. And that made it nice for me. You know, like, oh, that's nice, I'm doing this now. But if I had, in the first place, said, you know, what one thing people do is, like, they're like, oh, I want to be on this label, and I've noticed they do this and that, so I'm going to do this and that. And, like, I think that gets rid of the kind of organic development of your own sound. If you immediately decide you want to be on record label X, and you try and make something that impresses them, I don't know, maybe that can work. Maybe that can, I don't know. I mean, for me, maybe I'm lucky in the way that I've achieved stuff I didn't aim to achieve, but I'm glad I have, if that makes sense. I never thought I'd be here. I never thought I'd play 10 minutes down the road, let alone 9 hours across the sea. I never thought I'd do that. And it's nice that I am. But I feel like if I had aimed for it, I might have tried too hard and it could have gone the other way. Does that make sense? I don't know. I really don't. So my advice is don't listen to me. I don't know.
I am a new breakcore producer. If you have any advice for me, email me.